Welcome to today's podcast. My name is Pearlie Brewer, and I will be your host. Today's podcast guest is Alex Tuff from St. John's, Newfoundland. Today we're going to talk to Alex about the loss of his brother Chris in a workplace accident on Saturday, August the 3rd, 2013. Welcome, Alex.
Thanks, Pearlie, for having me on the show.
Alex, why don't you start by walking us through what you can remember about Saturday, August the 3rd, 2013?
Well, Pearlie, I was 18 years old. It's going on almost 11 years now. And I remember I was working at a retail store, and I was just about to get ready for work, and I received a phone call from my stepmom. I was in the shower, to be honest with you, and I got out. There was a voicemail there. I called her back, and she said, "You can't go to work today," on this voicemail. I was like, "What do you mean?" Okay, whatever. I called her back, and she said, "No, we can't tell you over the phone, but we're coming to get you." Now, my parents have been divorced for, separate families for 25 years now. So very, bit weird for them to be coming to get me. I lived at my mom's house, so on and so forth. So she said, "Go out by the door. We'll wait for you there." Okay, so immediately I was convinced one of my grandparents was dead. And as sad as that would have been, that's unfortunately the reality of it, isn't it? So I go out, and my dad had this old 94 Mercedes. The thing was so loud, you could almost hear the thing before you seen it, right? So he came around the corner, and he stopped the car. He jumped out, and he hugged me. And he said, "There's been an accident, and Chris has been killed." So at that moment in time, my best friend, my mentor, and my brother was killed in an industrial accident.
So how did each of your family members react to Chris's death?
Well, I knew my dad's reaction from that that bit of interface we had in the middle of a roadway outside my house. So I asked my dad, I said, "How did Mom take it?" And she didn't know. She didn't know yet. So then I just was in the back seat of the car. We drove to her work. She was working that day. And we were going down the middle of the road, going through red lights, going through stop signs. We finally made it to her work, and I went in, and I figured, I'm 18 now. I'm the man of the family per se, and I've been assigned the duty to tell my mom that her other son has been killed in an industrial accident. So I go in, and I see her working at her desk, and I couldn't do it. I don't know if the fact I was in shock. But the words wouldn't come out. I just rapidly found myself nodding my head back and forth, and I couldn't do it. I said, "Go outside, Dad's waiting," and vivid memories of her fists pounding on my dad's chest, and she kept repeating, "My baby, my baby, my baby is dead," in the middle of a parking lot on a Saturday afternoon. So, not well. They didn't take it well. They still don't take it well. But, all this disruption in our simple little lives because of an employer's negligence towards the health and safety and welfare of their workforce.
So what did your family initially find out about the circumstances of Chris's death?
How did they find out?
How did they find out, and how much did they find out initially?
Well, we knew for about an hour. We were about 2 hours per se. We knew, unofficially we'll say. We found out through Chris's employer, his boss. They called my father, and I guess it was, I don't know, maybe, contact information or something, whoever they could call. And then when we were at my mom's work, actually, the RCMP called from Happy Valley Goose Bay, where Chris succumbed to his injuries. And we know very little. We knew that there was an explosion. We knew that it happened in Happy Valley Goose Bay. We knew there was a truck involved, but very little. And it was hours, really, before our family knew to the full extent. And the RCMP just said, occupational safety was involved, of course, being at the time there were no OHS officers stationed in Labrador, unfortunately, due to, whatever, staffing shortages or what have you. I'm not sure why. But a couple of officers had to fly up from St. John's to Goose Bay, which, if you do the milk run, is 4 or 5 hours away. So, again, I think at this point, everyone was just in awe. We were just trying to process it. But really, at this point, the facts didn't matter right now because we knew he was dead. And that's all that really mattered to us, that he was not alive. But yeah, it was a few hours for sure, and that's how our family found out. And then, of course, you're always going back and saying, well, this is what we were told initially, and then things change and stories changes, right? And I guess we really didn't find out what really truly happened for 6-7 years after, when the agreed statement of facts came out through the courts, is really when we got the true story. Because up until that time, it was a lot of speculation.
So what was the facts that did come out in the end?
The facts that came out in the end is that there was 2 employers involved. There was an employer who is into fabrication, fueling aircraft, tank work. This company is in aviation services, and they had a tank farm. So Chris was working with a welding shop, fab shop here in St. John, or CBS was where it was too. Conception Bay South is the name of the community. And the company that Chris was working for, they picked up a job in Labrador. And with that, he was sent off. But that's the job they were sent to Labrador for wasn't to do this tank job. They were up there working on the substation or Muskrat Falls or something, the big power generating station up there. So on the weekend, of course, unless you're from Labrador, there's nothing to do. So, the company, the third party who owned the tanks, they approached Chris and his boss in the work truck. I think they were eating lunch or something. And they said, "Hey, fellers, you want to make a bit of extra money on the weekend or so?" And, why not, to some extent. And, the job that this company wanted performed on one of their tanks was to remove what's called a double wall baffle, which is inside these tanks. So if you can picture the type of truck that holds, the B tanks that fuel aircraft, that bring home heating fuel to your homes, these type of tanks. From the outside looking in, these tanks are one big structure. To the uneducated, naked eye, we'll say, these look like one big tank. But on the inside of these tanks, there's what's called baffles. So multi-purpose. These baffles are designed to store separate chemicals and gases. So, for example, the tanks that fuel up your gas station, well, they're bringing regular gas, they're bringing supreme gas all at once, but it's separated by baffles. So that's one benefit of a baffle. The other benefit of a baffle is for physics, I guess you'll say. It's to stop the flow of fluid back and forth. So when this vehicle applies the brakes, it's not going to cause all the fluid to rush to the front, and so on and so forth. So these baffles they're double walled. So if you can picture, a wall running the entire, circumference of this tank, just an inch away, there's another one. And they're called double walled because if one side were to leak, it wouldn't spoil the batch of the other one. Little did we know at the time that these tanks are aluminum. And the properties of aluminum is that it's very porous. Just like our skin, right? There's a lot of, dirt, debris. That's why my wife's always on me to clean my face, right? So we don't get the pores and the blackheads and so on. Same thing with aluminum. You have to clean it and allow the fluid to release from the pores per se. So, the tank was cleaned by the internal company who owned the tank. But what they failed to do is that they failed to clean inside these baffles. So again, you can imagine these tanks are, 10 feet wide, probably 10 or 12 feet high, with an inch void in these baffles running the entire circumference of it. I mean, you can imagine that's quite a bit of void space. So over time, the fluid that was in the tanks, they absorb into the baffles. And this area is a prime location for vapors and other flammable, compounds to hide. These baffles are designed to be cleaned. They're intended to be cleaned. They're people who are, I'm going to use this word lightly, they're experts, we'll call them for the sake of this. There's a little plug at the bottom of these baffles. And the idea is that you stick a steam jetty into the plug and you actually spray water inside the baffle. And of course you let it flow out, you suck it up, and you gas test. Nothing was done, Pearly. So if you look at our Act and regulations in Newfoundland and Labrador, just like New Brunswick, just like Nova Scotia, just like every other Canadian province and territory, there's rules and regulations around doing confined space work. This company didn't do nothing. There was no permits. There was no rescue plan. There was no gas testing done. Oh, hold on now. Let me rephrase. The company stated in courts that they did gas test, but that was by means of smelling the space. There was no gas testing done, appropriate gas testing done. No PPE was required by worn by Chris. And Chris was also not trained in confined space entry, which is awful. His access and egress was eliminated because he used a ladder to enter this confined space, which was then removed to allow for more room to work in the tank. A plasma cutter was used to remove these baffles. So essentially what the company wanted, they wanted one big tank, if you can imagine, right? They wanted these baffles cut out. And, so nothing was done. And then when Chris went to go take the plasma cutter and touch it on the baffle, he made one little hole the size of a dime, maybe a dime, but between a dime and a quarter, I'm told. And it's at that moment immense pressure built up inside the baffle and forced the baffles outwards, fatally injuring him. Chris received extreme head and face injuries, and a forced cremation was ordered by our chief medical examiner for the province of Newfoundland and Labrador.
Terrible.
Yeah, it's pretty graphic.
Was the company ever charged?
Yeah, so there's four parties here. So it's the company that owned the tank and the tank farm and the other pieces of equipment, of course. It's the company that Chris worked for, the welding company that Chris worked for. And then there's supervisors on both sides. So all four, the government or the Crown will say, was successful in charging the companies to some extent. The one company was charged $55,000 in a boatload of course, charges. The other company was charged $45,000, and each supervisor received a monetary fine of between $3,000 and $5,000. In addition, they were ordered to complete a safety for supervisors training because clearly they're not supervisors. I could go on for hours and talk about supervision. I won't, but the term supervisor to me almost needs to be protected, such as lawyer, doctor, practitioner, so on and so forth, because, when you hear a lawyer, you don't question their education, do you? You don't question what they have. When you hear a doctor, you don't really question what they have, but when you hear supervisor, some people, again, don't question it, but what do you really need to be a supervisor nowadays?
Yeah.
Not much. So that's the charges there.
Now, when workplace accidents happen, I don't think some people understand how it affects the whole family. If you look back at the last decade, roughly, how has that affected your family? Mom, dad, yourself, and so on, grandparents, whatever. Just to give people a sense that it's not just, someone died, but it affects everyone.
It really does. It's every aspect of my life is affected, from the career choice I chose to go through. My mom in particular, and with my whole family in particular, but of course, my mom, to the point where, you see a visible change in both my parents when Chris's name gets brought up. It's like, it's like a piece of their bodies had been cut out and the wound just left open to bear the elements. You know, I felt like as if our family had been a four-legged table when one leg had suddenly been torn away, the remaining of us feeling wobbled and teetered. You know, just waking up every day to the realization that Chris is gone. You know, a certain level of guilt sits in too, doesn't it, Pearlie?
Yeah.
When you know, the younger sibling at the time, because I've now surpassed the age of Chris when he died. Chris was 24 when he died. I'll be 30 this year. And, so these unwanted milestones from a house, graduating college, buying your car, every fella wants their truck, right? So they go get their truck. So I've bought the truck. I've had children since. I've had a child since that, will never have a chance to meet his uncle. So here we have all these milestones that turn bittersweet really quickly when you're realizing that you are achieving much more than what your dead sibling in this case, did not get to achieve. And yeah, it's quite unique. And then something as simple as, you know, of course I'm getting older, so now I'm attending a lot more weddings, just to give you an example. So, you know, typically if the groom in particular had a brother, then they get up and give this best man speech, and that just kills you, you know, because it's like I got married since. We did a rather small ceremony, but I never had that opportunity for my brother to give a best man speech. And these are just a few examples. For my mom, she lost her baby. She lost her firstborn child. You know, I have a son now myself. He's 2 years old, and I'm like, I can't imagine. It's just unfathomable of what parents in particular have to go through, and siblings have to go through when there's workplace fatality. It's unspeakable. And when you see your mom or your dad, for that matter, crying at a headstone or a gravesite or on an anniversary or a birthday. I mean, Chris's 34th birthday or 35th will be next week, next Saturday, June 15th. So, you know, again, it's supposed to be very wholesome, very celebratory, and now it's quite depressing, to be honest with you.
So there's an organization called Threads of Life. How did you get involved with them, or how did you actually even become aware of them first?
Yeah, good question. So I was 18 as I mentioned, when Chris died. I was in school. I was actually in school for safety at the time. No connection to it. People always ask, "Oh, you must have got in safety because your brother." I didn't, but it certainly helps. Gives me that little bit of a fire, gives me that little bit of personal experience. And so I guess fast forward, I was in safety school. We'll say I was in college, and an organization called the Newfoundland Labrador Construction Safety Association, they were looking for models. Okay, they were rebranding. They were looking for models, and they came to our school and they said, "Hey, if you help us rebrand and get your photo taken, we'll credit you to some safety training." I was like, awesome. Poor student, just starting out. You're asking me to volunteer for the safety organization. I mean, why not? So again, a bit of a long story short, I attended this modeling session, and we went out for lunch. Okay, we went out for lunch during this photo shoot, and one of the safety advisors there at the NLCSA at the time, her name is Tammy, and I really have to thank her very much. But she mentioned at the time, she said, "Hey, did you guys hear about that 24-year-old guy who got killed up in Labrador in Happy Valley Goose Bay?" And I was like, "Did I ever?" I said, "It was my brother." And that just kind of snowballed into, hey, there's this organization called Threads of Life. It's an association assigned to helping families of workplace tragedy, illness, and fatalities, of course, and life-altering just issues, whatever's going on. And then that kind of snowballed, and it was very recent, very new. It was just very raw at the time. So I believe I chewed it up and reached out to them on my own terms, because that's how Threads of Life operates. They wait for the families to reach out to them as first. So yeah, just kind of, chewed it up and contacted them and say, hey, I'm struggling. I need some help. And they said, why don't you come up to a family forum in Nova Scotia? And I did my first family forum. I went by myself, kind of like, let me just see what this is all about. My parents didn't go at this one. And here we were. And then it was everybody from the Atlantic provinces and the Maritimes, so Newfoundland, Labrador, there are PEI people, Nova Scotia people, Nova Scotia families, New Brunswick families, and maybe even some Ontario and Quebec. I'm not sure where the border draws, but we all met at, where was it to? Oak Island in, not Oak Island, but there's a hotel around there. I'll come to me in a second, in Nova Scotia. But yeah, we all met there, and we have grief counselors and sessions and just talking about what happened to us, and that turned into me getting more involved with them, to sitting on various committees for the Threads of Life organization, organizing the local walk here in St. John's, Newfoundland, to eventually becoming part of their speakers bureau and being a, I guess you could say, a professional speaker for them, a volunteer speaker, and going out to various organizations and various conferences and podcasts and, various things. And this is kind of where to now, where I ended up.
So how have they been able to help you?
Well, what they do, they're good at connecting. See, the thing is, it's when someone passes away, or say gets cancer or has lost their arm or lost their leg, it's hard to show empathy if you haven't gone through it yourself to some extent, right? I mean, there's a certain level of sympathetic responses people give, the whole type of, it's going to be okay, blah, blah, blah. Yeah, you hear it, but you don't really feel it unless the person you're talking to has lost a brother, who's lost a sister, who's lost a child, who also lost their arm, for example, or also lost part of their hand. I mean, until you've actually met someone who's, that they've gone through the same feelings, it's hard to connect with people. So that's what they do. They connect people who've gone through similar experiences. So just in the terms of meeting these individuals and attending various support groups and walking, we just held our walk here in St. John's. It's usually held on the first or second Sunday in May, every year during NAOSH week. But, I often refer to my work as I'm giving a voice for the voiceless, right? I'm advocating for people who have unfortunately succumbed to their injuries, whether it's an injury, an illness, or disease, and I'm being that voice, and I'm fighting for those people who can't fight for themselves anymore. So that's really how it's helped me through that Threads of Life journey, right? So,
has Threads been able to help your mother any?
I think there has to be a certain level of, you have to give yourself up to some extent, right? And I think that's for my parents, that's very difficult to do. I think you have to let yourself be a bit vulnerable sometimes. And I think, my parents, they did attend one family forum, and it was really tough. Mm-hmm. It was really tough, Pearly, and they certainly have helped, but I wouldn't say to the same extent as it helped myself. But I think it's Threads of Life is the club that doesn't want any new members. It's not, you're not going to see ads on Facebook saying, click here, we want your subscription, we want your membership, we want everybody. It's just not how the structure of the organization works. It's the club that nobody wants to join, nor do they want more people to join, if that makes sense, right?
Yeah.
So I think, like I said, it's certain you have to give up a little bit of yourself, you have to be a bit more vulnerable, and I just don't think my parents are there yet in their in their journey of recovery. And be honest with you, I don't know if they will.
Yeah. So what have you been doing since that day in 2013? You mentioned at the time you were in a course. What sort of occupational things have you been up to since then?
So I was in safety, as you know, as I mentioned there. So when I graduated, again, my brother was dead at deceased at this point, and I graduated with a diploma in occupational safety. And I said, well, I can't give this up now. this is my opportunity to do what's right and hopefully go out to every single welding shop in particular and ensure that they're following the Act and regulations. So I got hooked a job with, funny enough, ironically enough, the Newfoundland Labrador Construction Safety Association, right? So that photo shoot really helped me, I guess. So I hooked a job with them, and I was a trainer with them for almost 8 years. So I was teaching everything from traffic control to WMIS to, fall protection and, of course, confined spaces, where I used to retell the accounts that happened that day. And, just when you look at someone and you've achieved that, oh yeah, I get this now, I got you moment, then my work was done. I worked with him for 8 years, and I've really enjoyed the teaching, and I do miss it. But I have moved on to, I work at Workplace NL now. So the new province of Newfoundland Labrador's compensation board. I'm a health and safety advisor there as well in the prevention services department. So I do very similar work, actually. I'm just not teaching as much. So I'm more of a consulting, if you will. I'm like a free consultant to employers. They call in, they want information, advice. I do a little bit of education and training on the side as well for these employers. And I work essentially with the employers that need the most guidance in the province, and that's where I'm to now. And the employers that need the most guidance are sometimes the employers that are having the most injuries as well. So that's what I'm into these days. So still at safety, still doing safety full time.
So to sort of conclude our podcast here today, what health and safety message would you have today for the following three groups: employees, supervisors, and employers? Thinking back to what happened to your brother, if you were to meet with an employee group, group supervisors, group employers, what are the messages that you'd like to really drive home to them?
Well, I guess I can be quoted saying the fish rots at the head, right? So I want to start there, and if you don't have a good structure, a good captain driving a boat, or whatever analogy you want to use, the fish will rot, and it's going to start at the head. So let me start with employers. My message to you employers is that you can delegate your authority. You can delegate your, responsibility to some extent. But at the end of the day, you cannot delegate or give away your accountability. You are always going to be accountable to the person that's been with you for the most. The person will say, if we're following a hierarchy, to the VPs and the supervisors, and right down to the person that was hired yesterday. You can never dish out your accountability. Your accountability. You have a legal responsibility to ensure the health and safety and welfare of your workforce while they're in your employ. And that doesn't even end there. I mean, people who aren't in your employ as well, you're responsible for, if you're doing any site work or what have you. Safety has to be budgeted. Of course, we can all agree that there is at the end of the day, you have to find a middle ground between safety and production. Too much safety, you're not going to be making any money, and then too much production, there's not enough safety. So it's up to an employer to find that middle ground. But once you find it, you're golden, and that's where you want to be operating into. Unfortunately, employers, a lot of the employers that I've encountered with is they do focus on a lot of the production a little bit too much, and they don't budget safety. We'll say they don't think safety has to be built into their program and running an operation. That's just simply not true. So that's my message for employers. As for supervisors, is this, again, I could go on and talk about hours about supervisors, is that what is the term supervisor? So in our legislation, supervisor is anyone that has the authority to give direction and control and has been authorized by an employer to do that. So that could be a foreman, it could be a journey person, it could be a charge nurse, for example. It could be any of these fluffy titles. So if you're listening to this podcast now and you have one of these, say, I got to call them fluffy titles, and you're saying, okay, I'm a charge nurse. Let's just go with that one. You are a supervisor. And you may not be given the title of it. You may not be given the pay of it. you may not be given the truck and the work phone or whatever the case may be if you're a foreman, but under the law, if you are given direction and exercising direction and control over your workforce, you are in fact a supervisor. So I guess it's a multi-message here. I guess I want to start by saying, make sure you know what you're actually accountable for. Make sure you know you've had that conversation with your boss, with your employer, and you're all on the same page. Like, hey, am I a supervisor? Because that can sometimes be a bit gray as well. And if it's very well known that you are a supervisor, your title states you're a supervisor or superintendent, again, check in with your employer. Make sure that you're doing what you're supposed to be doing. But a lot of the times, I've encountered thousands of supervisors in my 11 years doing this, Pearly, and again, I hate statistics, but 80% of the time we're going over the act and regulations. People say, I didn't know I was responsible for that. Because their employer came to them and said, hey, I want to be a supervisor, here's a truck, here's the phone, here's the pay, but they don't give them the other responsibilities besides that. So yeah, make sure you understand what you're responsible for, and knowing is only one thing, but actually, practicing, putting the theory into practice is what I would also suggest to supervisors. And, if you're uncomfortable with another thing I'll tell supervisors is get comfortable with the uncomfortable. So unfortunately, there's rules and regulations and policies that are established by the governments and bodies, and there's guidelines, and also there's just internal policies and procedures that your employer has set out. And if you're not willing to enforce them, set the expectation, set a good example, be a good mentor, show up on time, be courteous, be realistic, be empathetic, and realizing that people have the old expression that people, they're working because they have to. They don't want to. They work because, they want to make a paycheck. So if you have to be, courteous of people's work-life balance, but if you're not able to do any of those things I've just listed, maybe being a supervisor is not for you. And that's a hard conversation you got to have with yourself. And also, if I could just go back to employers for a second, if you're an employer, they're your eyes, they're your ears. It's impossible for you to be around 100% of the time. So the person that you're making a supervisor, make sure that they know what they're at and train them to be competent and qualified, right? And I guess skipping on down the chain here is the workers. Listen, it's at the end of the day, the actions that are taken at a workplace, be it, wherever you're to, will affect you in your every single day. Workplace NL in particular just put out a slogan. It's like, it's workplace injuries hurt the most at home. I'm not sure if you've heard that, but it's 100% true. You're with your not having the ability to lift a kid or change a diaper or go out and sit in the grass with your child will literally eat away at you physically and mentally. So the actions that you take at the workplace will impact every aspect of your life. So my advice to you is make sure you're adequately trained, you're comfortable with the work you're doing, and don't be afraid to ask questions. If people are asking you to do something that you're not comfortable with, say no, refuse it. Use your right to refuse. You also have a right to know about the hazards that you're being expected to work in and the work conditions that you're expected to work in there. So question everything, fight for training, fight to be included as a member and participate in any initiatives or meetings or inspections or hazard assessments. Just if you're not satisfied with that, then find a new employer.
Look, Alex, thank you very much for joining us today and sharing your story. It obviously has to be very hard. Obviously, you have many good memories of your brother. Cherish those memories. And to our podcast audience, never forget that it can happen to you. It does happen every day across our country. Sometimes people will say, oh, no, it's not going to happen to me. But unfortunately, it still does happen. For our listeners, stay safe. And we'll see you next week.